At merely 7 years old, Sarah barely reached her father's elbow, gripping a worn crimson bonnet in her delicate fingers. Yet within moments, this tiny child would perform an act so remarkable it would silence an entire community and alter the destiny of 2 cultures forever. The dawn air crackled with unease as thunderclouds assembled. Overhead, like ominous harbingers, Sarah May positioned herself next to her father, William, at the border of their modest homestead. Observing as a band of indigenous horsemen advanced across the windswept prairie, the tribal envoy moved with determination, their commander riding prominently with the bearing of one who wielded unquestionable authority. William's calloused palm naturally settled upon his daughter's shoulder, sensing her petite form quivering slightly, not from terror, but from something entirely different. The 7-year-old had always demonstrated an extraordinary capacity to perceive beyond what grown-ups deliberately overlooked. Today, her youthful gaze fixed upon something that accelerated her pulse with worry. War Chief Benjamin Crow Eagle descended from his mount with the elegant fluidity of someone who had dedicated his existence to horsemanship. His commanding presence demanded immediate recognition from every homesteader who had assembled to observe this unforeseen encounter. The breeze strengthened, bringing the aroma of incoming precipitation and the burden of unvoiced tensions between 2 factions who had grown accustomed to regarding each other with distrust. As the war chief advanced to confront William, the initial raindrops began descending. What commenced as a mild drizzle rapidly evolved into something more ominous. The heavens darkened additionally, and the gale intensified, hurling dust and fragments across the homestead territory. That's when Sarah detected something the grown-ups appeared to miss. The chief's lined countenance displayed unmistakable indicators of someone battling against nature's offensive. Yet it wasn't merely the precipitation that troubled her. There existed something fragile about his manner of standing there, vulnerable to the weather. Preserving his honor despite mounting uneasiness, the young child gazed down at the small crimson bonnet in her grasp, the one her mother Emma had crafted for her mere days earlier. It wasn't substantial, yet it held immense value for her. The material had been thoughtfully selected, the needlework completed with devotion during lengthy twilight sessions beside candlelight. As the downpour intensified, Dress reached a choice that would amaze every witness present. She advanced forward, away from her father's sheltering presence, and approached directly toward the formidable figure of War Chief Benjamin Crow Eagle. The adults surrounding her appeared motionless, unsure whether to halt her or have faith in her pure motivations. With her gentle voice piercing through the sound of strengthening rainfall, she uttered words that would resonate in the recollections of everyone who observed them. Yet what War Chief Benjamin Crow Eagle performed in acknowledgement of her action would demonstrate that occasionally the most meaningful displays of leadership emerge not from power, but from acknowledging the sincere truth that emanates from an innocent spirit. The quietness following Sarah's approach felt more oppressive than the storm clouds overhead. Every gaze in the settlement concentrated on the small girl as she offered her treasured crimson bonnet toward the towering chief, her voice scarcely heard above the mounting wind. "Here, my bonnet will shield you," she stated simply, presenting the small piece of fabric as though it were the most obvious action imaginable. War Chief Benjamin Crow Eagle remained still, deep eyes examining the child before him. The rain fell consistently now, saturating through garments and converting the earth beneath their feet into mire. The other tribal members behind him stayed mounted, their faces indecipherable as they observed their leader confront this unexpected moment. William felt his heart pounding against his ribcage as he watched his daughter stand there entirely exposed, offering something precious to a man whom most homesteaders perceived with suspicion and dread. Yet Sarah seemed unaware of the tension encompassing her, concentrated entirely on her wish to assist someone who required protection from the tempest. The chief's weathered face disclosed nothing of his thoughts as he looked down at the small bonnet being presented to him. For an instant that extended like infinity, nobody stirred. The rain persisted falling, and the wind persisted howling, yet everything else seemed frozen in time. Then something altered in War Chief Benjamin's expression. The severity that had characterized his features began softening, replaced by something resembling amazement. He knelt down gradually, bringing himself to Sarah's eye level, its powerful frame now humbled by the simple honesty radiating from the child. "You would offer me your bonnet?" he inquired, his voice carrying a tenderness that surprised everyone who heard it. Sarah nodded sincerely, pushing the bonnet nearer to him. "The rain is chilling you. Mother always teaches we should aid people when they require it." Behind the chief, several of his tribal members exchanged looks that conveyed their own astonishment at witnessing this interaction. They had arrived here anticipating the customary tensions, the cautious negotiations that marked most encounters between their peoples. Instead, they were observing their respected leader engage with a small child who perceived him not as a menace or outsider, simply as someone who needed assistance. William took a step forward, uncertain whether he should interfere, yet something in the chief's manner made him hesitate. There was no peril here, only something profound developing between his daughter and this man who commanded such reverence from his people. The chief reached out slowly and received the small crimson bonnet from Sarah's extended hands. As his fingers closed around the simple fabric, something passed between them that transcended the barriers of age, heritage, and the conflicts that had kept their peoples separated. Yet what War Chief Benjamin Crow Eagle performed next would not only astound every person watching, it would initiate a chain of events that would transform the relationship between the homestead and the tribe in ways none of them could have envisioned. War. Chief Benjamin Crow Eagle held the small crimson bonnet in his hands for an extended moment, his eyes never departing Sarah's trusting face. The rain continued falling around them, yet something in the atmosphere had shifted completely. What occurred next would be discussed for generations. The chief slowly positioned the tiny bonnet on his head. The sight was almost amusing. This powerful, dignified leader of warriors, wearing a child's faded crimson bonnet that barely covered the crown of his head. Yet instead of appearing absurd, there was something deeply touching about the gesture. Oh, the great war chief Benjamin Crow Eagle, who commanded respected braves and had negotiated with territorial officials, was wearing a 7-year-old girl's bonnet in the rain. A collective intake of breath arose from both the homesteaders and the tribal members. Nobody had anticipated this. The other natives sat frozen on their horses, their expressions shifting from surprise to something approaching reverence. They had followed this man through countless trials, had seen him confront armed groups and dangerous beasts, yet they had never seen him do anything like this. Yet the chief wasn't finished. He reached into his leather vest and withdrew something that made every person present hold their breath. It was a holy eagle feather, one that held profound significance within his tribe, the kind of feather that was never bestowed lightly. It represented honor and respect earned through acts of bravery and wisdom. "Hey, this belongs to you now," he said to Sarah, his voice carrying across the homestead despite the rain. "Your spirit sees what grown people have forgotten how to see." Sarah's eyes widened as she accepted the feather, holding it carefully as if she understood its importance, even without knowing its complete meaning. Her father, William, felt his throat constrict with emotion as he watched his daughter participate in what was clearly a moment of profound significance. The chief rose to his full height again, the small crimson bonnet still perched on his head, and turned to address not just William but every homesteader who had gathered to witness this meeting. His voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being heard and obeyed. "This child has shown me something today," he announced. "She has reminded me that protection comes in many forms, and that the greatest strength is sometimes found in the smallest gestures." The rain was beginning to ease slightly, yet nobody seemed to notice. All attention remained focused on the chief, who still wore Sarah's bonnet like a crown of honor. The tribal members behind him had dismounted now, their own expressions showing a mixture of respect and curiosity about what their leader might do next. "We came here today to discuss the boundaries between our peoples," War Chief Benjamin continued, his eyes sweeping across the assembled crowd. "Yet I think we have discovered something more important than land disputes." The tension that had filled the air when the tribal delegation first arrived had been completely transformed. Yet what the chief proposed next would challenge everything. Both groups thought they knew about coexistence and force them to make a decision that would determine their future for years to come. War Chief Benjamin Crow Eagle adjusted the small crimson bonnet on his head and looked directly at William Thompson. The gesture seemed to transform the entire dynamic of the gathering. turning what had begun as a tense territorial negotiation into something none of them had anticipated. "Your daughter has given me something precious," the chief said, his voice carrying clearly across the muddy ground. "Now I propose we give our children something even more valuable." Through both groups, several homesteaders shifted uncomfortably, uncertain where this unexpected turn was leading. Behind the chief, his tribal members remained silent, yet their expressions suggested they were equally surprised by their leader's direction. "What do you mean?" William asked, his hands still resting protectively on Sarah's shoulder. Girl stood quietly between the two men, clutching the sacred feather she had been given, seemingly unaware that she had become the catalyst for something much larger than anyone had planned: war. Chief Benjamin gestured toward the children visible among both groups' homesteader children, peering out from behind their parents and young tribal members who had accompanied the delegation. "Let our children learn from each other. Let them see that protection and kindness know no boundaries." The proposal hit the assembled crowd like a thunderclap. Exchange between their peoples had always been carefully controlled, limited to necessary negotiations and trade agreements. The idea of allowing their children to interact freely was revolutionary and potentially dangerous. "You're talking about bringing our children together?" asked Rebecca, one of the homesteader women, her voice tight with concern. "How can we be sure of their safety?" "The same way this child was sure of mine," the chief replied, touching the brim of Sarah's bonnet. "Through trust that must be earned, yet first must be offered." William felt the weight of every eye upon him as one of the most respected men in the homestead. His response would likely influence how others reacted to this unexpected proposal. He looked down at his daughter, who was examining the feather with wonder, then back at the chief, who still wore her bonnet with such dignity. "What exactly are you proposing?" William asked carefully. "One day each week, let the children of both our peoples gather at the creek that flows between our lands. Let them learn each other's games, share stories, discover that what they have been taught to fear is simply different, not dangerous." The rain had stopped completely now, yet the tension in the air had only intensified. Several of the tribal members were exchanging glances that suggested they were just as uncertain about this proposal as the homesteaders. This was uncharted territory for everyone involved. Margaret pushed forward through the crowd, her maternal instincts clearly at war with her protective fears. "And if something goes wrong, if old conflicts resurface?" War Chief Benjamin's expression grew serious as he considered her question. "Then we will face the consequences together as people who tried to build something better for our children." Yet what none of them realized was that someone had been watching this entire exchange from the shadows. Someone whose presence would soon turn this moment of potential unity into the greatest test any of them had ever faced. The sound of approaching hoofbeats cut through the thoughtful silence that had settled over the gathering. Every head turned toward the distant ridge where a lone rider was approaching at dangerous speed, kicking up clouds of dust and mud in his wake. William's expression hardened as he recognized the rider. Marcus Whitfield, a man whose hatred for the native tribes was well known throughout the territory, was bearing down on them with the fury of someone who had witnessed something that enraged him beyond reason. "This is not good," William muttered under his breath, instinctively stepping closer to Sarah, behind War Chief Benjamin. The tribal members tensed visibly, their hands moving toward their weapons with practiced readiness. Marcus reined in his horse so hard the animal reared, foam flecking its mouth from the hard ride. His wild eyes took in the scene before him, the chief wearing a child's crimson bonnet, the homesteaders and natives standing together in apparent harmony, and worst of all, his own neighbors appearing to consider some kind of agreement with people he viewed as enemies. "What in tarnation is going on here?" Marcus shouted, his voice carrying the kind of rage that turned reasonable discussions into bloodshed. "William, have you lost your mind? You're standing there talking terms with them while they're planning our destruction." War Chief Benjamin remained calm, despite the obvious hostility radiating from the newcomer. Yet his stance shifted almost imperceptibly into something more defensive. The small crimson bonnet still sat on his head, yet now it seemed like a symbol of everything Marcus despised about this unexpected gathering. "Marcus, lower your voice," William said firmly. We're having a peaceful discussion here. Peaceful. Marcus's laugh was harsh and bitter. I've been watching from the ridge for the past hour, and I know exactly what this really is. This is how it starts. They gain your trust with pretty words and children's gifts. Then they strike when you least expect it. Sarah pressed closer to her father, the sacred feather still clutched in her small hands. She could feel the ugly tension that Marcus's arrival had brought to what had been a moment of hope and possibility. You don't understand what you saw, Emma tried to explain, stepping forward to support her husband. I understand plenty, Marcus snarled. I understand that you're all being fooled by a performance designed to make you drop your guard. And I understand that someone needs to show them what happens when they try to manipulate honest people. Chief's warriors had moved their horses into a protective formation behind their leader. While the homesteaders instinctively clustered closer together, what had been a gathering full of potential was rapidly transforming into the kind of confrontation that could destroy any chance of peace. Yet Marcus wasn't finished. The rage burning in his eyes suggested he had come here with a purpose that went far beyond disrupting negotiations. What he planned to do next would force everyone present to choose sides in a conflict that none of them had wanted. Marcus reached into his saddlebag and withdrew a crumpled piece of paper, holding it up like evidence in a trial. His face was flushed with the kind of righteous anger that made dangerous men do irreversible things. This morning I received word from the territorial commissioner, he announced loudly, his voice carrying across the now silent gathering. New directives about dealing with native tribes who venture too close to settled areas? A chill ran through both groups as they realized Marcus was about to weaponize official authority against the peaceful gathering that had been unfolding. War Chief Benjamin's expression remained stoic, yet his warriors shifted restlessly behind him, sensing the threat that was materializing. Marcus, whatever that says, this isn't the time, William said, trying to maintain control of a situation that was rapidly spiraling beyond anyone's ability to manage peacefully. This is exactly the time, Marcus shot back, according to these directives. Any unauthorized gathering between homesteaders and tribal groups requires immediate intervention by appointed territorial representatives. He paused dramatically, letting the implications sink in before delivering his crushing blow. I am the newly appointed territorial liaison for this district, which means I have the authority to end this little meeting right now and to ensure that no such meetings happen again. The words hit the assembled crowd like physical blows. Several homesteaders looked stricken as they realized that Marcus now held official power to enforce his personal prejudices. The tribal members, meanwhile, began looking toward their chief for guidance on how to respond to this unexpected legal threat. Sarah looked up at her father with confusion written across her young face. She didn't understand the meaning of territorial directives or official authority. Yet she could feel the fear and anger that Marcus's announcement had triggered in everyone around her. You can't stop people from talking, she said suddenly, her small voice cutting through the heavy tension. Mother says, talking is how people fix problems. Marcus's cold gaze fell on the little girl, and his expression twisted with something approaching disgust. Child, you're too young to understand how the world really works. Some people can't be trusted, no matter how pretty their words sound. War Chief Benjamin's jaw tightened at hearing Sarah addressed with such contempt, yet he remained silent. Recognizing that any response from him would only escalate the confrontation that Marcus was deliberately provoking, I'm giving everyone here 5 minutes to disperse, Marcus continued. Pulling out a pocket watch with theatrical precision, the tribal delegation will return to their territory immediately, and the homesteaders will return to their homes. Any attempt to continue this gathering will be reported as a violation of territorial law. Yet as Marcus spoke, his horse suddenly shied at something moving in the tall grass nearby. What emerged from that grass would change everything about the confrontation, revealing a danger that made territorial politics seem insignificant by comparison, forcing bitter enemies to make an impossible choice about who they could trust when everything was at stake. 4 armed men emerged from the tall grass with rifles raised, their faces hidden behind dirty neckerchiefs. The horses of both groups reared and whinnied in alarm as the outlaws positioned themselves to control every escape route from the gathering. Area! Nobody move, growled the leader, a scarred man whose eyes held the cold calculation of someone accustomed to taking what he wanted through violence. We've been watching this little meeting, and it looks like we found ourselves a nice collection of valuable people and horses. Marcus's territorial authority meant nothing to men who lived outside any law. His face went pale as he realized that his official papers and appointed status offered no protection against criminals who recognized no government but their own greed. The horses, the weapons, and anything else worth taking, the bandit leader continued, gesturing with his rifle toward both the homesteaders and the tribal members. Strip off anything valuable and drop it on the ground. Anyone who tries to be clever will regret it. War Chief Benjamin's warriors tensed, their hands moving instinctively toward their weapons. Yet the chief himself raised a subtle hand to stop them. 4 armed men in good positions could kill several people before being overwhelmed. And there were children present who could be caught in any violence that erupted. Sarah pressed against her father's leg. The sacred feathers still clutched. In her small hand, she could feel the fear radiating from every adult around her. Yet she could also sense something else's shared understanding, that the artificial divisions between their groups meant nothing when faced with men who threatened everyone equally. "The little girl can keep her feather," the bandit leader said with mock generosity. Having noticed Sarah's frightened grip on the tribal gift, yet everything else of value goes in the pile. That's when something unexpected happened. Marcus Whitfield, the man who had arrived intent on destroying any possibility of cooperation between the groups, found himself looking at War Chief Benjamin with an expression that contained no hatred, only grim recognition of their shared predicament. "Many more of you are there?" William asked the bandits, trying to assess their chances if fighting became necessary. "Enough," came the unhelpful reply. "And they're positioned where they can see everything that happens here." War Chief Benjamin adjusted the small crimson bonnet on his head and caught Marcus's eye. Without words, some kind of understanding passed between them. The territorial liaison, who had come to enforce separation between their peoples, was now facing the same threat as everyone else. And survival might depend on the very cooperation he had tried to prevent. "We can take them," one of the younger tribal warriors whispered urgently to his chief. "Not without losses we cannot accept," War Chief Benjamin replied quietly, his eyes never leaving the bandits while his mind calculated possibilities and risks. Yet what none of them realized was that Sarah hadn't noticed something about their attackers, that the adults had missed something that might give them the advantage. They desperately needed to turn this deadly situation around. Sarah tugged on her father's sleeve and whispered something that made his eyes widen with sudden understanding. She had noticed what none of the adults had seen. The bandits kept looking nervously toward the same empty ridge, waiting for signals that never came. "They're lying about having more men," William whispered to War Chief Benjamin, who still wore Sarah's crimson bonnet. "My daughter noticed they keep checking the same spot where nobody is." The realization spread quickly through both groups. The bandits had been bluffing about their backup, counting on fear to control a larger group of people. War Chief Benjamin gave an almost imperceptible nod to his warriors while William caught the eyes of the other homesteaders. "Now," the chief said quietly. What happened next was swift and coordinated. The tribal warriors moved with practiced precision, while the homesteaders attacked from the opposite direction. Marcus, despite his earlier hostility, threw himself at the bandit leader with surprising courage. Within moments, all 4 outlaws were overpowered and disarmed, their threats reduced to empty posturing. "Check the ridge," War Chief Benjamin ordered, and one of his warriors rode out to confirm what Sarah had suspected. He returned, shaking his head. There were no other bandits positioned anywhere nearby as they tied up their captives. Something remarkable was happening among the adults. Marcus looked around at the mixed group of homesteaders and tribal members who had just fought together to protect their children and families. The artificial divisions he had been so determined to enforce seemed meaningless now. "I owe you all an apology," Marcus said, his voice rough with emotion. "I let fear and old prejudices blind me to what was really important." War Chief Benjamin removed Sarah's small crimson bonnet and knelt down to return it to her. Yet the little girl shook her head and pushed it back toward him. "It looks better on you," she said simply. "And besides, now we're friends." The chief's weathered face broke into the first genuine smile anyone had seen from him that day. "Yes, little one. Now we are friends." 4 months later, the creek between the homestead and the tribal lands had become a gathering place every Saturday. Children from both communities played together, learned each other's games, shared stories that their parents were beginning to understand held more wisdom than years of suspicion and fear. Sarah still carried the sacred feather that war chief Benjamin had given her, and she had learned to weave simple patterns from one of the tribal children. In return, she had taught several native children to read English words using a primer her mother had provided. Marcus Whitfield had officially recommended to the territorial commissioner that the weekly gatherings be supported rather than restricted. His report noted that cooperation between the communities had led to better security for everyone. It's evidenced by their successful capture of the bandit group that had threatened the region war. Chief Benjamin still wore Sarah's crimson bonnet during important tribal meetings, claiming it reminded him that the greatest wisdom often came from the most unexpected sources. The bonnet had become a symbol within his tribe of the power that flowed from approaching others with an open heart rather than closed fists. William and Sioma watched their daughter play with children from both communities and marveled at how a simple gesture of kindness had transformed fear into friendship, suspicion into cooperation, and division into unity. The little crimson bonnet that had started it all was now faded even more from weeks of wear, yet its value had only grown. It represented proof that protection comes in many forms, and that sometimes the smallest acts of compassion can build bridges that seemed impossible to construct. If you enjoyed this tale, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable frontier story where bravery and fate collide in ways you never expected. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.